Welcome to this edition of Labor Vision. I'm Bob Delaney, Executive Director of the Institute for Labor Studies and Research. Labor Vision, a production of the Institute, focuses on topics of importance to working Rhode Islanders. We hope you enjoy this edition.
Awful racist dialect. There's the cover of the journal there. In Newport News, Virginia, the Boilermakers made sure that the black workers were paid 50% of what the white workers were making. In Tampa, they called the Klan to visit black workers' houses after the workers had the temerity to protest some of the working conditions they were under. 300 African-American workers were fired from a Walsh-Kaiser yard in Portland, Oregon, and another 165 of them were fired from a Walsh-Kaiser yard in San Francisco. So with all of this in mind, the African-American organizers like James Williams set about trying to make sure that the same problems didn't surface in Providence because things had started off so well. Williams had first written a letter to the president of the Boilermakers Union in Kansas City asking him not to set up the auxiliary in Providence. He never got a response. He then went to the Federal U.S. Employment Service and asked them to intervene, but they said they couldn't do anything about it. And then he wrote a letter to Congressman John Fogarty asking him to intervene. And while Fogarty had given some initial impression of wanting to help and try to see what he could do, in the end, he didn't do anything either. So as a result, the workers figured out they had to figure out things on their own. Williams luckily met George Smoke. Now, George was already an activist. He served as the secretary for the NAACP-affiliated Colored American Club in his hometown of Fall River. And he was considered the lead man in his department. He was born in Birmingham, Alabama in 1907, and he eventually made his way north, and he became a teacher at the Mount Vernon School in Lincoln, Rhode Island. But as World War II broke out, he ended up taking a job at the shipyard because it paid a lot more than what being a teacher would pay. So as Williams was organizing in Providence and running into roadblocks everywhere, George Smoke actually traveled to New York City on his own to meet with the Urban League officials there at their headquarters. And it was this confluence of people all starting to get involved in the issue at the same time. So the Providence Urban League was contacted by the national office, who put him in touch with George. And that's when things start to get interesting. So in the September of 1943, the Boilermakers business agent, a man named John McGuire, started to hand out new membership cards to all of the African-American workers. When the workers had first signed up, they all signed a white card. Now all the black workers were given a pink card, designating them as part of the auxiliary. They were also told that even though they'd already been in the union, were already paying dues, that they would have to pay a $13 reinstatement fee for the glory of being able to join the auxiliary union that had no rights. After Williams and Smoke first met, they decided that they needed to confront the local union about this process to make sure that if there was going to be an auxiliary, what are the facts, because nothing was being shared with the members. So in September of 1943, George Smoke took to the floor of the union hall and demanded to be recognized. When he got to the microphone, he asked a series of questions. He wanted to know if it was true that an auxiliary union was being formed. If so, he demanded, who formed it? Where was it formed? Who voted for it? He wanted to know if it was true that the African-American workers were going to have to pay this $13 initiation fee, and why it was so if they had already been members in good standing. Now, he didn't get any answers from the international representatives who were running the meeting. So another worker, a man named Jack Norton, he was a white member of Boilermakers Local 308. He took to the floor. And he put forward a motion before the body that the local union would admit any member regardless of skin color. Now, this is 1943, in an international union that part of its constitution was to make sure that there was segregation. And right here in Providence, the white workers started to join with the black workers to say, you know what, that's not the way we're going to do it here. Now, I point out that Norton is white for a couple of different reasons. The first is, in the historiography of this story, if Norton appears at all, they list him as a black man. Now, the archives make it clear, and some of the things that are on the screen show that, the Providence Urban League archives has a lot of notations about things that Norton either said or wrote, and every time they did it, they made sure to point out, white member. Right? But I think getting his identity correct helps transform this story, because it now becomes a story not just some disgruntled African-American workers trying to fight a racist structure on their own and going to court to try to make a difference. Now it becomes a story of white and black workers struggling together and identifying with each other's struggle in a way that takes it from simply a battle of discrimination to one about cross-union, cross-culture solidarity. And this is something I think, as we talk about it some more, we can learn from. See, not only was the labor interracial solidarity unique to Providence, it was also an example of the black workers leading the way and the white workers following. That's not a story that often gets told in American labor history. And I think it's an important reason why, if we think about the powerful forces that are trying to divide the American working class today, it's something that we need to keep in mind about how we need to overcome the barriers that the powers that be try to put up in front of us. So the next step after the meeting that Smoke talked about was to see what the local leadership was willing to do about this issue. James Williams met with the local president, Americo Petrini, an Italian-American immigrant, and he was incredibly excited to find out that Petrini was also in support of the integrated local union. Williams pledged to fight with the black workers to fight alongside Petrini and against the auxiliary. And Williams also pledged to help Petrini get reelected in the upcoming December election by campaigning amongst the black workers for Petrini's reelection. It's not clear why there had to be another election in December, since there was just one in the summer. And there's nothing in the literature that explains why that might be the case. But I'm pretty sure that if a local election causes a wildcat strike, things were pretty unsettled, and maybe the idea was this December election was going to settle the idea of who's going to be leading the local union. As we'll see, it really did not settle matters at all. So while Williams was working with Petrini, George Smoke started to agitate on the shop floor with his co-workers. In November, he stood for nomination to the Boilermakers Convention that was supposed to take place in January of 1944, only to be told by the international representative, a man named William Buckley, who would go on to be the Secretary-Treasurer of the Boilermakers, that as a member of the auxiliary, he was forbidden to run for office and even to attend the convention. Undaunted, however, George wrote a letter to his fellow workers at the shipyard with the help of Williams and encouraged all of them to vote for the Petrini slate. And he had this great line in this letter that I think it just helps sum up exactly what the fight was that they were going for. So he wrote, "Our nation today is fighting for its very life. Whether the nation survives as a democracy and a land of opportunity for all people may be determined in some small measure by what we do in Providence next week." Now, Election Day arrived on December 14th, and the black workers voted throughout the day. But when it came time to count their votes, it was discovered that all of the ballots that black workers had submitted were marked with the letter C. They were put into a segregated envelope. And as the vote counted, the international rep Paul Hovey, he kicked all of the black members out of the union hall. The African-American workers at first refused to leave. With tensions running high, Williams conferred with the local president Petrini about what to do next. After being assured that the local union had enough support to protect the voting process, the African-American Boilermakers left the union hall and joined Williams outside. Williams wrote later that he was very concerned about civil disturbances erupting, but Petrini assured him that not only did they have the votes to win the election, they had the votes to make sure that the local stuck with Norton's motion to integrate. There were about 2,700 votes cast, not counting the 400 votes that were marked with the letter C from the African Americans. Petrini lost the vote by 120 votes. The men were devastated. While they were struggling about what to do next, local NAACP officials contacted Thurgood Marshall from the NAACP legal department, who agreed to come to Providence and meet with Petrini, local NAAC attorney Joseph LeCount, and the members that were involved. Statements were taken from 4 African-American members, including Smoke, and a request for an emergency restraining order was filed in Superior Court on December 16th. On December 17th, Superior Court Judge Charles Walsh granted a temporary restraining order, stopping the Boilermakers Union from destroying the contested ballots, and set a hearing date for the turn of the new year in January on the matter. Now, before they got to court, there was a special union meeting that was called on December 29th. Only the white workers were allowed in the meeting. But while they met, Jack Norton stood up again and made another motion to not only reintegrate the local union, but to make sure all of the ballots were counted. It was told that the motion passed unanimously to the sound of great applause. Now, it should be noted that Norton was also a candidate on the Petrini slate. He was running for recording secretary. So sure, he had an interest in making sure the votes were counted, but to think of a union hall in a contested election full of white workers unanimously voting to support integrating and counting their African-American brothers' ballots in 1943 is remarkable. So in mid-January the next year, the trial begins before Judge Alexander Churchill. And both white and black workers testified that the will of the members was to integrate and count all of the ballots. Another African-American worker named Carlton Blunt was asked if he was ever told why the letter C was put on his ballot. And I love this line from him because it's just perfect for a person named Blunt. He said, "No, but I had a pretty good idea." Now, when the Boilermakers International rep, William Buckley, took the stand, he testified under oath that he did not order the ballots to be marked with C, and that his only instructions were that members of the official union, not the auxiliary, could vote. When pressed on this point by Attorney Marshall, Buckley offered that if the candidates on the 2 competing slates agreed to count the C ballots, he would have agreed to do so. Pressed again by Marshall about whether or not that very motion was made by the 2 competing slates at the December 29th meeting, Buckley parried, and he told Marshall, "Well, I called the meeting to attempt to straighten out a muddled situation. No resolution was ever requested of me." Marshall pounced. "Wasn't a resolution put to you as a result of your statement that you had called the meeting, and didn't the local recommend that these ballots be counted?" Buckley answered meekly, "Yeah, that was their recommendation to me." Marshall pressed forward, asking Buckley if a member of the Providence Auxiliary didn't like the supervising officers from the white local, what could these workers do about it? Buckley answered that they could attend the Boilermakers Convention and make a protest. Marshall asked again, "But didn't you say yesterday that auxiliary members were not eligible to attend conventions?" Buckley's answer, and I don't know how he could say this with a straight face, "Yeah, that's right, but their friends could go." So, Judge Churchill ruled in favor of the black workers and voided the union election results. He also ruled that the auxiliary union was unconstitutional under the United States Constitution. The first time that action had been taken by a judge in the United States, right here in Providence. However, this was only a hearing on the injunction that the workers had filed. If they wanted to get this ruling by Judge Alexander to stick, they would have to go through a full trial, and that was scheduled for later on in the spring. Now, to support their efforts, and especially to raise money for the legal work, George Smoke and the other workers formed what they called the Allied Victory Committee, and they set about raising funds. Now, they needed to raise a lot of money. The transcripts alone from the day-long hearing would have cost $350. Now, laborers at the shipyard made 88 cents an hour. Skilled laborers made $1.25. $350 might have been $35,000 for people making that little money, and especially during wartime. But they set about and they raised the money. Smoke, there's actual record keeping within the Urban League's records that show that both white and black workers contributed to the cause to raise the funds. Smoke was incredibly articulate in how he communicated this issue to his co-workers. In one fundraising flyer, he wrote, "We have a profound belief in the future of organized labor. But that belief can only be sustained by the right to work and earn a living on an equal and impartial basis. Our contention is not against organized labor and its proclaimed principles. It is against a small and vanishing, but powerful and yet still existing element of labor which is fighting a desperate and losing battle to maintain an anti-American barrier between white and colored workers. They would prevent a real alliance of democratic elements of American labor if they could." With the funds finally raised, the workers proceeded to trial. The full trial produced a number of new and interesting elements that hadn't come out yet. For example, one worker, Gerald Hill, who was actually the named plaintiff in the suit, he told the court that even though his ballot was marked with the letter C, he was able to rub it off and stick it in the official ballot box before anyone noticed. One of the union stewards, a man named John Jeremiah, who was part of the election committee, he told the court that even though he and the other members of the election committee wanted to count all of the ballots, it was International Rep. Paul Huffey who told him, quote, "Johnny, these colored fellas can't vote in this election and they won't." In an interesting twist, however, one that has so far not been part of this story anywhere in the literature, is the fact that a clerk from Local 308, a woman named Pauline LeBlanc, testified that it was she who put the letter C in all of the African-American workers' ballots, under the instructions of International Rep. William Buckley, who had earlier testified that he had no idea how that took place. But she told the court that there were only 73 ballots with the letter C on them. So, even if all of the African-American workers voted for Petrini, he still would have lost the election. Testimony would wrap up in a day or so, but the judge never issued a decision, because the last day of the trial was June 6, 1944, D-Day. So obviously there were more pressing matters in the country at that time, and especially at a shipyard who was building ships for this very invasion. Motions were filed, briefs were submitted, but the judge never finalized his order, because as this trial was winding down, a similar trial in California at the Walsh Kaiser shipyard in San Francisco had made its way to the California Supreme Court, and following Judge Alexander's decision, they also ruled auxiliary unions were unconstitutional. Courts across the state, across the country, started to do the same thing. By 1948, the Boilermakers Union and the AFL unions that had similar structures had all made auxiliary unions a thing of the past. Now, it's important to note that even as Local 308 started to fade away, the shipyard itself was closed in 1946. Production stopped mid-1945, and for the next year, they started to wind down operations. But George Smoke continued his activism. He was invited, and it's not really clear how he got the invitation, but he was invited to participate in October of 1944 at a symposium at Howard University on the subject of, quote, the post-war industrial outlook for Negroes. I think it's great that this took place in October of 1944 with the war still going on a year later, and they're already talking about what things look like for particular communities after the war ends. Now, George was on the panel with the executive vice president of the Boilermakers Union International, a man named William Calvin. And Calvin gave some platitudes about how, the war will be over soon and we need to, start to think about working together with people. George went right at him, and he said, listen, any serious look into the coming post-war era poses some very provocative questions for the colored American ship worker. The chief questions concern the continuance of the tacit agreements between management and certain elements of organized labor by writ or ritual discrimination against colored mechanics and unskilled ship workers. While such practices are not general through the structure of organized labor, they are nevertheless used and in many cases condoned by management. Now, as I said, Local 308, as the shipyard disappears, Local 308 disappears. But this seemingly quiet end to Jim Crow unionism in Providence seems to raise a lot more questions than answers. For one, the thing that jumps out at me is, what was the actual status of the contested ballots? Why did George Smoke and his allies think that there were 400 ballots, but only 73 ended up showing up? It's perfectly logical that some of those ballots just were disappeared. Maybe they were stolen, maybe they were lost, maybe they were misplaced, but something seems fishy there. But then you remember that Thurgood Marshall was the attorney here. And it doesn't seem likely to me that someone with his stature would leave that kind of issue to go unchallenged. But it appears to be the case that when they found out that there were only 73 ballots, no one, including Thurgood Marshall, challenged that representation. But it's also equally plausible that there were only 73 ballots that were marked with the letter C. Remember, this local had 10,000 members. Only 2,700 showed up to vote. That's about 30%. Now, it's conceivable that every African-American worker did show up and vote. But is it really likely, especially given the tension over this very particular issue at the workplace? I mean, even if they did a Herculean get out the vote effort and got 50% or 60% of their members to come out and vote, it's still a lot less than the 400 that they thought that they had in hand. And it's an unanswered question of why that is. But still, another question is, why did Petrini lose this election? Why was it even so close? If every time they had a union meeting, the membership voted unanimously to support an integrated local, sometimes to applause, when people actually had the chance to vote for the slate of officers who were in favor of that, they didn't vote for that slate. Now, only things that we can do is really speculate about what that is. I mean, maybe it was hard feelings over the way Petrini won the election in the first time. Maybe it was some kind of Bradley effect, where the white workers were telling their co-workers that they would support Petrini, but when they got into the ballot box, they actually reverted right back to racial prejudices that they were all born with. But we really don't know. But unlike the other places in this country, Portland and where local union officials were decidedly against integration, and Bethlehem Steel in Baltimore, where the local unions encouraged a race strike when the company tried to hire 3 African-American workers. This local went out of its way to make sure that their black comrades were welcomed into the fold. Why they voted against that particular slate then remains a mystery. In 2006, some of the members of the society have seen this. The Boilermakers published this beautiful testimonial book about the history of the Boilermakers Union. It's got color pictures and stories of organizing drives and all of the ships that they built during World War II. Local 308 appears nowhere in it. It has completely disappeared. I called up the Boilermakers Union, and they actually have a full-time archivist who works in their headquarters. They have no records of Local 308 at all. Nothing. Now, what he did tell me is that it was chaos in World War II. Local unions were formed, grew to tremendous heights, and disappeared all within 3 or 4 years. So it's not surprising that there weren't any records. But with the history of this case and all of the paperwork that was going back and forth, it's surprising and it's disappointing that there aren't that many records left. As I wrap this up, I think there's some conclusions that I try to draw from this, and I'd be curious to know what other people think. The first is this. Despite the hype, the working class, both white, black, brown, or whatever, when given a chance, they will work together to fight as equals for the things that workers across this country have known that they need. Decent working conditions, a safe environment, decent pay, and the ability to not be bothered and harassed at the workplace. The second thing that I take away from this is this, that sometimes big history is really made by little people, people that will never get the credit, that won't appear in the history books, but who nonetheless make a huge difference. And one of the reasons why I'm honored to be able to give this talk with you tonight is because without us in this room knowing about the story and sharing it, even if it's in this small little world of Rhode Island Labor History Society folks, that means that the memory of men like George Smoke, Gerald Hill, Carlton Blunt, and others won't disappear and fade off. Because what they did here in Providence, in a lot of ways, changed the American labor movement for the better. Thank you.
Thank you for joining us for this edition of Labor Vision. We appreciate your input and encourage your comments. Labor Vision can be seen on this channel 3 times each week: Tuesday at 7 p.m., Thursday at 8 p.m., and Saturday at 5 p.m.